European troops are now arriving in Greenland, not after a crisis, but during quiet diplomatic talks that failed to reach an agreement. And that timing is what's raising questions. Because while official statements describe this as routine training and reconnaissance, the deployments are happening at the exact moment negotiations between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland reached what officials called a fundamental disagreement. This isn't about tanks rolling in or borders changing overnight. It's about signals, who is sending them, and who they're meant for. And the most important part of this story isn't what was said publicly. It's what happened when the talks didn't produce a solution. On the same day diplomats met in Washington, European military personnel began arriving in Greenland's capital, Nuuk. France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and several other NATO members confirmed that small contingents were being deployed as part of a reconnaissance and training mission, at the invitation of Denmark. Officially, this is being framed as preparation, fact-finding, exploring security options in the Arctic. But context matters. The meetings in Washington included Denmark's foreign minister, Greenland's foreign minister, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. According to Danish officials afterward, the discussions were constructive, but unsuccessful. They did not resolve what Denmark described as a fundamental disagreement with the United States over Greenland's future. And within hours, European forces were on the move. That sequence is why this moment feels different from past Arctic exercises. Greenland's economy is small. Its population is roughly 56,000 people. Its GDP is measured in single-digit billions. Yet strategically, Greenland sits at one of the most important geographic intersections on the planet. It lies between North America and Europe. It hosts the Pituffik Space Base, a key part of USB, missile warning, and space surveillance systems. And beneath its ice, it holds vast deposits of minerals classified as critical for modern economies. Publicly available geological data suggests Greenland contains occurrences of 25 out of the 34 raw materials the European Commission labels as critical. These materials are used in electric vehicles, renewable energy systems, advanced electronics, and modern defense equipment. Right now, both the United States and the European Union are heavily dependent on foreign supply chains, particularly China, for many of these materials. Greenland represents potential diversification, but potential is not the same as reality. Only one critical mineral site in Greenland is currently being mined. And that gap between what exists geologically and what is economically extractable is where geopolitics enters the picture. U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly stated that Greenland is vital for American national security. In public remarks following the Washington meeting, which he did not personally attend, Trump sounded more conciliatory than before. He acknowledged Denmark's interests. He said he believed something will work out. But he also reiterated a familiar argument, that Denmark would be unable to prevent Russia or China from occupying Greenland without U.S. involvement. Importantly, Trump said he was not ruling out any options, while also suggesting that cooperation remained possible. That ambiguity is intentional. It allows pressure without immediate escalation. And it's exactly that ambiguity that European governments appear to be responding to. The European deployment to Greenland is small. In some cases, it's fewer than 20 personnel per country. Germany sent a 13-person reconnaissance team. France confirmed an initial contingent of around 15, with more assets expected later. Officials have emphasized that this is not a combat deployment, but symbolism matters in international relations. According to multiple European officials, the goal is to demonstrate that Greenland's security is a shared NATO concern, not a bilateral issue between Washington and Copenhagen. As one senior French diplomat reportedly put it, this is about showing that NATO is present, not to provoke, not to challenge, but to remind all parties that Greenland is not isolated, and that reminder arrives precisely as talks stall. Amid these developments, Greenlandic leaders have been unusually direct. Deputy Prime Minister Mute Egede told reporters that increased NATO presence should be expected, including more flights and ships, describing them as training activities. At the same time, Greenland's Prime Minister has made the island's position clear. Greenland does not want to be owned by the United States. It does not want to be governed by the United States. And it does not want to become part of the United States. Public opinion data supports that stance. Polling conducted earlier this year found that approximately 85% of Greenlanders oppose leaving Denmark to join the U.S., with single-digit support for such a move. That public sentiment complicates any strategy based on persuasion alone. Which brings us to the next layer of this story: the money question. According to reporting from multiple outlets, Trump's team has reportedly discussed the idea of direct payments to Greenlanders, figures ranging from $10,000 to $100,000 per resident. No formal proposal has been announced. No mechanism has been outlined. And any such plan would require congressional approval. But the idea itself signals something important. This is no longer being treated purely as rhetoric. It suggests that parts of the U.S. administration are exploring practical pathways, however controversial, to reshape Greenland's alignment. At the same time, polling in the United States shows very limited public support for using force or coercion in Greenland. That puts pressure not just on diplomacy, but on U.S. domestic politics as well. After recent events elsewhere, including U.S. military actions in Venezuela, Congress has shown increased sensitivity to executive overreach. Any attempt to change Greenland's status would require congressional involvement. Even strong rhetorical pressure against the territory of a NATO ally risks crossing political red lines in Washington. This creates a narrow corridor. The U.S. wants greater strategic access. Denmark wants to preserve sovereignty. Greenland wants autonomy and stability. And Europe wants to prevent unilateral shifts in Arctic power. That's why some analysts believe the most likely outcome isn't acquisition, but expansion. Expanded U.S. troop presence, expanded defense cooperation, expanded investment in minerals, all within existing agreements. Enough for Washington to claim success. Enough for Copenhagen to maintain sovereignty. Enough for Greenland to avoid being absorbed, but whether that balance can hold is still an open question. To understand why Greenland keeps returning to the center of global politics, you have to separate economic size from strategic value. Greenland is not wealthy in a traditional sense. Its economy relies heavily on fishing. Roughly 90% of its exports come from fishery-related products. And each year, Denmark provides a block grant worth several hundred million euros to support public services. By GDP alone, Greenland would barely register on the global stage. But GDP is not what makes Greenland valuable. What matters is location and what lies beneath the ice. According to publicly available geological surveys, Greenland contains significant deposits of rare earth elements and other critical raw materials, the kinds used in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, advanced electronics, and modern defense systems. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates around 1.5 million tons of mineable rare earth reserves. Danish and Greenlandic geological authorities place the total potential much higher, over 36 million tons, though most of that remains commercially inaccessible. This distinction is crucial. Having minerals in the ground does not automatically translate into supply security. Extraction in Greenland is expensive, slow, and politically sensitive. Environmental regulations are strict, infrastructure is limited, and public resistance to large-scale mining remains strong. So while Greenland cannot replace China as a rare earth supplier anytime soon, it represents something else: optionality. And in strategic planning, options matter. Much of the public justification for increased military attention to Greenland references potential threats from Russia and China. China currently dominates global rare earth processing and a large share of extraction. Russia has been expanding its Arctic military infrastructure for years, reopening bases and increasing patrols. Neither country is currently attempting to occupy Greenland, but Arctic competition rarely operates on immediate action. It operates on positioning. Shipping lanes are opening as ice retreats. Satellite coverage, undersea cables, and early warning systems are becoming more valuable. And control over logistics hubs in the high north can shape power projection decades ahead. From that perspective, Greenland is less a prize to be seized and more a node to be secured. That framing helps explain why European NATO members are acting now, even without a direct trigger event. They are not responding to an invasion. They are responding to uncertainty. For European governments, the Greenland issue presents a delicate balancing act. On one hand, they broadly share U.S. concerns about Arctic security, Russian activity, and long-term Chinese influence. On the other hand, any perception that a NATO ally's territory could be pressured or reconfigured without consent threatens the alliance itself. Several European leaders have been explicit about this. Poland's prime minister warned that any attempted annexation of NATO territory by another NATO member would be catastrophic for collective security. French officials have framed their deployment as a political signal rather than a military escalation. German and Nordic governments have emphasized coordination with Denmark and Greenland, not unilateral action. The message is consistent. Security cooperation is welcome. Sovereignty challenges are not. That distinction explains why the current deployments are deliberately limited in size, duration, and mandate. They are visible enough to matter, but restrained enough to avoid confrontation. While governments debate strategy, the impact on Greenland's population is more personal. In Nuuk, Greenlandic flags have appeared in shop windows, on balconies, and on vehicles, a visible display of national unity. Interviews with residents reflect a mix of pride, concern, and unease. Some describe feeling suddenly exposed, thrust into global politics without asking to be there. Others express hope that increased attention could bring investment and opportunity, as long as it doesn't come at the cost of self-determination. That tension between opportunity and autonomy sits at the heart of Greenland's dilemma. Greater strategic importance can bring resources, but it can also bring pressure, and pressure is exactly what Greenland's leaders are trying to manage. One reason this situation has not escalated faster is the existing legal architecture. Under a 1951 defense agreement between the U.S. and Denmark, Washington already has broad authority to operate militarily in Greenland. That includes expanding troop numbers, infrastructure, and surveillance, with Danish consent. Without changing sovereignty, from a purely practical standpoint, the U.S. does not need to own Greenland to achieve most of its stated security objectives. This is why many analysts argue that talk of acquisition may be less about necessity and more about leverage. By raising the stakes rhetorically, the U.S. increases its negotiating power over basing rights, investment access, and long-term strategic alignment. And by responding with coordinated European deployments, Denmark and its allies are signaling that leverage cuts both ways. Despite sharp language, most indicators point away from confrontation. Trump has acknowledged Denmark's role. European deployments remain symbolic. Congressional constraints limit drastic moves, and Greenland's public opposition to annexation is overwhelming. What remains is a narrow space for compromise, expanded joint exercises, more visible NATO presence, greater U.S. investment in mining, under Greenlandic and Danish oversight, and political narratives that allow all sides to claim success. In international politics, face-saving outcomes often matter more than formal victories. And that brings us to the question that now hangs over the Arctic. If negotiations stall indefinitely, if rhetoric hardens, if domestic politics in any capital shift unexpectedly, then Greenland could move from symbolic deployments to permanent strategic competition, not through dramatic action, but through gradual accumulation. More troops, more infrastructure, more overlapping claims of responsibility. And once that process begins, reversing it becomes difficult. That's why this moment, quiet, procedural, and deliberately restrained, may be more important than it appears, because it's setting the boundaries for what comes next. One of the most overlooked aspects of the Greenland situation is how carefully everyone involved is choosing their language. No one is talking about conflict. No one is announcing red lines. No one is issuing ultimatums. Instead, leaders are talking about presence, training, cooperation, and security awareness. That choice of words matters because it reveals intent. NATO is not mobilizing for a crisis. It is repositioning for a future. And Greenland, whether it wants to be or not, sits at the center of that future. At its core, this episode is testing something fundamental. How does NATO manage internal disagreement when strategic priorities collide? The United States sees Greenland as indispensable to long-term security planning in the High North. Denmark sees Greenland as a matter of sovereignty, identity, and legal continuity. European allies see Greenland as a precedent. If pressure works here, it changes expectations everywhere. None of these positions are unreasonable on their own. The challenge is that they all operate on different timelines. The U.S. tends to think in decades. European governments think in election cycles and institutional stability. Greenland thinks in terms of cultural survival and self-determination. The current deployments are NATO's way of buying time, slowing the clock while preserving unity. As climate conditions evolve, the Arctic is becoming more accessible. That means shorter shipping routes between Asia, Europe, and North America, increased interest in undersea cables and satellite coverage, greater demand for early warning and surveillance infrastructure. Greenland's location makes it uniquely suited for all three. This is why multiple countries can look at the same island and see entirely different priorities. A military planner sees radar coverage. An economist sees raw materials. A policymaker sees alliance cohesion. A local resident sees home. Reconciling those perspectives is not easy and rarely happens quickly. Greenland's leadership has been clear. They do not want to choose between the U.S. and Denmark. Autonomy, not alignment, is the long-term goal. Greenland already governs most domestic affairs. Foreign policy and defense remain tied to Copenhagen by design. For Greenland, the fear is not increased attention itself. It's being forced into a yes or no decision before institutions, infrastructure, and public consensus are ready. That is why Greenlandic officials emphasize training, cooperation, and continuity, not transformation. They are trying to stretch the timeline. The arrival of European troops, though limited, changes the optics of the situation. It reframes Greenland from a bilateral conversation into a multilateral one. It signals that Greenland is not isolated. Denmark is not acting alone. Arctic security is a shared responsibility. This does not block U.S. influence, but it does anchor that influence inside alliance structures rather than outside them. For NATO, that distinction is critical. Because alliances weaken not when members disagree, but when they act alone. Despite dramatic headlines, most experts do not expect Greenland to change hands. What they do expect is a gradual increase in U.S. military presence under existing agreements, expanded NATO exercises in and around Greenland, more European involvement in Arctic monitoring, carefully managed investment in mineral exploration. In other words, function without formal ownership. That outcome allows every side to claim progress. The U.S. strengthens security Denmark, preserves sovereignty. Europe reinforces alliance unity. Greenland avoids absorption. It's not elegant, but it's stable. And in geopolitics, stability often beats clarity. What's happening in Greenland isn't about a single meeting, a single deployment, or a single leader. It's about how power shifts quietly, through logistics, agreements, and presence rather than declarations. Greenland has become a mirror, reflecting how today's alliances adapt to a more competitive world without breaking apart. The real outcome won't be decided in press conferences. It will be shaped by incremental choices made over years. And the Arctic is only one front in that process. Because similar questions are emerging elsewhere about resources, autonomy, and how far security commitments extend. That's what the next chapter explores. Not what happens to Greenland, but what Greenland reveals about where global strategy is heading next.